Damaged Defenders by Sherzad. Chapter 66. Soldier and Steve. Soldier was left to his own devices for a while. That had never really happened in the past. Someone was always there, giving orders, punishing him, training him, recalibrating him. Something. Under other circumstances, with another person, or just someone who was a person rather than a weapon with aspirations of being human, there might have been worrying anxiety and even fear. The soldier simply stood stolidly in place in the absence of orders. He had a raging headache from all the thinking he'd been doing. He had entirely too many questions and not a single answer to be found anywhere. Even if one of the Avengers had been in the room with him, he would not have dared to ask any of the questions rumbling around in his head. Just contemplating actually speaking, when speech wasn't a necessity, made him break out in a cold sweat. Never mind daring to question someone who was even nominally in charge of him. If weapons had emotions, he'd be terrified at the idea. Come to think of it, he kind of was, anyway. More and more, over the last couple hours, he'd started to think of himself as, well, something other than a weapon. He wasn't sure he was a person. Didn't people have names and other stuff like that? But he was becoming surer by the minute that he was more than just a weapon. With that realization had begun to come more human-like things, like having emotions about things. Top of the list being frustration at his inability to remember anything prior to about 2 weeks ago. At least not for sure. He kept getting flashes of things, but he had no idea if they were memories or something else entirely. Most of those flashes centered around a skinny, short, blonde kid. Soldier still had no idea who that might be, or even if they really existed, but if they had, they'd been important. After a while, Captain America and Loki showed back up. Captain America had a shiny foil packet and a bottle of oddly colored liquid in his hands. This time, though, there was no attempt to restrain him. Loki did, however, hold up a hand, palm towards Soldier, and let a wide swath of green gold energy flicker, the same stuff Soldier had seen him use to restrain him. Message received. He wasn't being held down, but he wasn't going to be able to attack them either. Whatever that stuff was, and however Loki did it, not even the arm had managed to make it give. Not that he wanted to attack them. Which was still odd, because that was his mission. Or it had been. To kill these people. He was still trying to figure out why he was defying that order. Though maybe that faint hope of better treatment was justification enough. As he'd noted, he had way too many questions and not a single answer. "Sit on the bed," Loki said, in a tone that made it really clear he was used to his orders being obeyed. Soldier's body more or less moved without his direction instantaneously obeying that tone of voice. He was sitting on the bed before he even had a chance to really register what was said. Behind Loki, Captain America's face was a study in horrified dismay. Soldier wondered why that bothered him so much. Question number 375 out of about 1,000. At that point, it became clear why Loki had not restrained him, but had made a point of reminding Soldier that he could stop him in his tracks. Captain America approached, opening both the bottle and the foil packet. Once opened, the foil packet was placed on the bed. "Eat the contents of the packet," Loki commanded again. Soldier noticed Captain America's cringe, but again he was obeying the order before he'd really registered what was said. Never mind had time to decide if he wanted to actually do that. Not that he would presume to second-guess one of his controllers. That way lay immense pain and suffering. The packet's contents proved to be a bar. Pretty similar to the rations he'd been given over the last 2 weeks by his other controllers. Grain, nuts, bits of fruit, and something sweet that glued the lot together. He chomped through the bar in about 3 bites. That growing part of him that was more person than weapon duly noted he could actually use more than just the one bar, but there was no way he'd say something. Even if extraneous speaking hadn't been beaten out of him, admitting to things like hunger, thirst, and pain had. Oh, he still registered them. Mostly pain. Hunger and thirst didn't usually impinge on his awareness until they got to a point where they'd compromise a mission. As much as his previous controllers had tried, they hadn't been able to make him as immune to pain as he was to hunger and thirst. Possibly because pain indicated a malfunction that might compromise the mission and thus needed to be dealt with. "Drink the liquid," Loki commanded. Again, Soldier obeyed instantly. That done, Captain America took the empty foil packet and drink container and backed off. Lie down on the bed, Loki commanded, and go to sleep. Soldier immediately obeyed the first half of that directive, lying as stiff as a plank on his back, arms straight at his sides. The second half baffled him. Sleep? What was that? Still, the two of them didn't seem to notice or care that he didn't obey the second half of the command. They just made their way out of the room. It turned out that Steve had, in fact, forgotten something on his list of things that needed to be done. Though, in fairness to him, he'd both been a little out of sorts when the subject got brought up and didn't have the training to understand the implications. What he'd forgotten to account for in his plans was the fact that there had been a half day or so of the drugs left in Bucky's arm. This oversight came to his notice less than an hour after the meeting broke up. Captain Rogers, Doctors McCoy and Reyes both indicate your presence is required in the quarantine lab, Jarvis piped up. Steve bolted for the stairs and thundered down them as fast as he could move, fast enough that he beat the exodus of the others on the common floor via the elevator. The moment he barged through the stairwell door onto the quarantine lab level, he swiveled around to find Hank and Cecilia. What is it? Hey, Cecilia started, only to stop when the elevator door opened and about half a dozen people spilled out. He's burning through the last of the drugs, starting to sweat. We have no idea what's going to happen from here, but if the drugs are there to help suppress his memory... Helping me there might help, Steve said. Steve wasn't quite sure if he wanted that to be the case or not. On the one hand, Bucky would remember. On the other hand, Bucky would remember. Frigga might have made it so Bucky wouldn't shatter under the weight of the memories, but a big part of Steve wanted to spare Bucky from remembering what had been done to him and what he'd been forced to do. The next hour or so, Steve spent pacing and watching a computer screen on the inside of the lab. Bucky had still been lying down from Loki's last order to him. Steve hadn't been able to bring himself to give Bucky orders under these circumstances. Thank goodness Loki had no such compunctions. The sensors in the lab made it pretty clear that Bucky was not having a good time. Steve couldn't read all the indicators, but his heart rate and breathing speed were through the roof, as was his sweating. According to the docs, pretty much everything in Bucky's body was either through the roof or through the floor. Despite that, Bucky was laying almost perfectly still, save for a couple of apparently involuntary glitches. About an hour in, they figured out what the drugs had been for, because Bucky started to shake violently and make this high-pitched, scared-to-death sounding whine that broke Steve's heart. About 5 minutes after that, Bucky abruptly sat up wild-eyed and still shaking like a leaf and scrambled off the bed into a corner of the room, curling in on himself defensively, all while still making that high-pitched whine. That did it. Steve didn't care if Bucky ended up clogging him when he could not just stand here and watch his best friend be that terrified. Before anyone could stop him, he slapped his hand on the control panel for the door and squeezed into the room the second the door cracked open. Cecilia and Hank both tried to tell him to stop. Hank even made a grab for him, but Steve managed to twist away at the last second. It was Bucky. Bucky hurt beyond the telling of it and scared out of what was left of his mind. Steve couldn't not go to him and do what he could to make the situation better. Bucky heard the door, and his head snapped up. He looked utterly terrified, but for whatever reason, he let Steve approach. Steve stopped a good 5 feet away and crouched down, trying to make himself a little less intimidating. Hey, it's okay. You're safe here. No one is ever going to hurt you again. And that was equal parts threat to anyone dumb enough to hurt Bucky, and promise. Because God help him, Steve would not hesitate to tear the world apart if... Yeah, better he not think about that. Being that pissed off would not help right now. Might actually make things worse if Bucky thought the anger was aimed at him. It's okay. You're safe, I promise. Steve lost track of how many times he said those words over the next 10 or 15 minutes, doing his best to keep his voice calm and soothing, though it cracked a few times. For a miracle, it seemed to work, at least a little bit. Or maybe it was just the fact that no one had thus far hurt Bucky. Whatever the case, the shaking gradually eased off, and his heart rate, while it never quite went down to normal, did drop down from where it had been, according to Cecilia, who kept him informed about Bucky's status, medically speaking. Steve was grateful for the official word, but it had been clear to him that Bucky was calming down some. He was still a little wild-eyed, and Steve didn't dare move at all, because he got the distinct impression that the relative calm would shatter into pieces at the first unexpected move. That said, he'd uncurled from his defensive pose a little bit, and wasn't jammed as far into the corner as humanly possible anymore. He also hadn't stopped staring at Steve the entire time, and around and under the fear, for the first time Steve saw something else. Curiosity. In the face of either no emotions at all, or sheer blind terror, seeing that curiosity gave Steve a much-needed shred of hope. Clearly the drugs had been suppressing Bucky's emotions, which sort of made sense. Whatever else had gone on, it was pretty clear the folks who'd done this to Bucky had been forced to use pretty extreme measures to control him. If Bucky didn't have any emotions, he wouldn't resent his treatment or anything along those lines and attempt to break free of his controllers.
Why?
Steve wasn't sure which of them had the bigger heart attack. Bucky flinched, like he'd been shot, curled back up and started shaking again after the word escaped him. Steve wasted about half a minute staring in disbelief that Bucky had actually spoken, heart breaking all over again. His reaction aside, the fact that Bucky's voice was closer to a croak than anything else made it pretty clear he wasn't used to talking. Has Steve mentioned lately how badly he wanted to kill the people that had done this? Because he did. He truly, deeply did.
Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. You can talk as much as you want.
Steve finally managed to get it together enough to try to reassure Bucky. Bucky gave him a blatantly disbelieving look that was so purely Bucky and something he'd seen 1,000 times that it stole Steve's breath and made his vision swim briefly with tears he fought to keep from falling.
I promise, no one is ever going to hurt you. They'll have to go through me first, and I'm not about to hurt you either.
It took everything Steve had to not mention that they were friends, not mention Bucky's name. He wanted to, painfully, badly, but the docs had all agreed that at least until Bucky started remembering, or admitted to remembering, things, they needed to avoid telling him as much about his past as they could. It would make it easier to know when Bucky was truly remembering versus just parroting what he'd been told.
As for why,
Steve continued, fighting to keep his voice even.
If you mean why we're helping you, well, it's pretty clear you're not doing this willingly. If you're asking why we're willing to keep you safe and not let anyone hurt you, pretty much the same answer. You're not doing this willingly, which means someone is forcing you, and I'll be damned before I let that sort of nonsense happen on my watch. And when we find the bastards, I'll explain that to them in person, in detail. The rest of the Avengers are entirely too happy to help, both with the stopping anyone from hurting you and the explaining things to the people that did this to you.
Bucky wore that disbelieving look the entire time Steve was talking. Steve wasn't sure what it was Bucky didn't believe. Maybe all of it. Whatever, he'd figure out, or remember, that Steve meant every word of it soon enough. Much as he didn't want to, Steve eventually left Bucky in the corner about 10 minutes of reassurance and general random babble later. Bucky seemed to be on the verge of sleeping, having worn himself out with the withdrawal and his reaction to it, something he probably needed pretty badly. Steve was pretty sure any attempt to move Bucky or get him to move would wake him all the way up, so he just backed out of the lab as quietly as he could manage. He was the next best thing to deaf and blind to the others, dimly aware of questions being asked, but not really caring, just needed to get out of there. He got about halfway to the elevator before he fell apart all over again, making an incoherent noise of rage and grief, and then putting his fist through the wall. Ignoring the blood and pain, he yanked his hand out of the wall and was about to punch it again when Thor intercepted him, grabbing his forearm.
Do not harm yourself thus, friend Steve.
Steve didn't generally cuss. Oh, he knew plenty of cuss words. Couldn't help knowing them after hanging around the commandos. He just didn't use them much. But if he had been that sort, Thor would have gotten an earful. As it was, the look he shot Thor could have peeled paint at 50 yards. He yanked on his arm. When Thor didn't instantly let go, it was all the excuse he needed. He'd been needing something or someone to punch since last night. He'd been doing his damnness to hold it together, but he was pretty much at the end of his rope. And Thor was the only one in the team who both could stand up to the sort of punishment that Steve could dish out and might just let Steve punch the crap out of him. There were a few others who could handle what Steve could dish out, but they'd all either fight back, potentially doing a lot of damage in the process, James, and especially Hulk, and not let Steve land any hits, Loki. He got about 3 hits in before he saw the look of understanding flare in Thor's eyes, and the next thing he knew, he was eyeball deep in a brawl. Thor fighting just enough to give Steve something to fight against without trying to flatten him, which Steve knew Thor could do if he went all out. Not that the brawl lasted all that long. 5 minutes, 10 tops. Then, between one punch and the next, the rage wore down enough for the grief to take hold, and Steve collapsed, tears streaming down his face.